The case we're going to discuss today is probably the most disturbing and cruel one I've come across in the past year, without a doubt. It's hard to even believe that such stories can happen in real life. But this case is shocking not just because of its brutality. More than anything, it's the unexpected twists that unfold as the story progresses that make it so unsettling. It all begins in a small town called Kuřim. This town has a population of around 10,000 people and is located in a country we haven't yet explored in our previous stories, Czechia. What makes this town notable? Well, first and foremost, it's this horrific and unbelievable case we're about to discuss today. On May 7, 2007, a man named Edward was fully occupied with household tasks. A major event had recently happened in his life. His child was born. His wife and newborn were still in the hospital, while his job was to prepare the house for their arrival. Cleaning, decorating, setting up the crib, typical preparations for bringing a newborn home. The last thing on his to-do list was figuring out how the baby monitor worked. A baby monitor, or a video nanny, is a device that allows parents to remotely keep an eye on their child. It consists of a camera and a monitor. The camera is placed next to the crib, and the parents, even from another room, can see their baby on the monitor as it receives a live feed from the camera. Edward's task was to set up the monitor to receive a signal from his own camera. At first, all he saw was static, just the typical white noise. However, after some adjustments, Edward finally managed to capture a clear image on the screen. Since the camera was set up facing the crib he had just assembled, he fully expected to see exactly that on the screen. But what he saw instead was something entirely different. On the monitor was a child Edward had never seen before. It wasn't a newborn. It was a boy, roughly between 6 and 8 years old. The child appeared tired. He was naked and sitting in an unfamiliar, eerie room. But why did Edward see this image in the first place? Well, it turned out that his monitor had accidentally picked up a signal, not from his own camera, but from another camera somewhere nearby. In other words, the camera belonged to someone in the neighborhood. At first, Edward didn't think much of it. The image soon switched back to his own camera, and he saw exactly what he was supposed to see: his baby's crib. Besides, at that moment, his wife called from the hospital, which distracted him. But later, Edward couldn't shake the strange scene he had witnessed. He went back to the monitor and started scanning through the nearby signals again. Eventually, he managed to pick up the same strange feed once more. The child was still in the same position as before, which was already alarming. It seemed like someone was keeping him confined under surveillance. However, the longer Edward watched, the more disturbing the situation became. Soon, he noticed the child's hands were tied. He was extremely dirty. Worse yet, the boy was eating off the floor. Realizing the gravity of what he was witnessing, and fearing the signal might disappear, Edward immediately pressed the record button. He was horrified. Of course, he wasted no time in calling the police. When the officers arrived, Edward showed them the footage on the monitor. As mentioned earlier, the signal had come from a neighboring house. However, Edward didn't recognize the child, nor did he know any neighbors who had a child of that age. The only option for the police was to check every nearby home. One of the first houses they visited was occupied by 2 women, 30-year-old Clara Mauer and her older sister, 32-year-old Katerina Mauer. Clara was a teacher, and Katerina worked at a local child care center. Since the footage showed a boy, the police were specifically looking for a child of that gender. Clara and Katerina confirmed that a child did live in their home, but not a boy. According to them, it was a 13-year-old girl named Anichka, Clara's adopted daughter. Still, the police asked to search the house. Unexpectedly, the sisters refused. Clara explained that her adopted daughter was sick and would be terrified if strangers entered the house, but the police insisted. The sisters had no choice but to let them in. Once inside, everything seemed normal. The officers didn't even see the 13-year-old girl that Clara was so worried about. However, after a few minutes, something suspicious caught their attention. At the back of the house, there was a locked door. Based on the layout, it appeared to lead to the basement. This immediately raised red flags. A locked basement was exactly what the officers were hoping to find. They asked the sisters to open the door, but Clara and Katerina claimed they were only tenants and that the basement belonged to the house's owner. According to them, they had never even opened the door, and only the owner had the key. The police were skeptical of this story, but for the time being, they left the house. They returned to Edward's home, where he was still recording the footage from the mysterious camera. The officers rewound the recording and listened carefully. That's when they heard something chilling, the same music they had just heard playing in Clara and Katerina's house. Moments later, they even heard their own voices on the recording. There was only one explanation. The abused child on the footage was inside the very house they had just searched, the house of Clara and Katerina. The officers rushed back and demanded that the sisters open the basement door. At that moment, the adopted daughter Anichka finally emerged from her room. To the police, she looked far younger than 13. At least mentally, she seemed to be at the level of an infant. She crawled on all fours, cried out, "Mama! Mama!" and clung to her Aunt Katerina like a small child. The officers could only draw one conclusion. Anichka most likely had a developmental delay or some sort of condition. Finally, the police had no choice but to break down the basement door. As soon as it swung open, a horrific stench filled the air. Down in the dark, damp, filthy basement was the very same boy Edward had seen on the baby monitor. Except now, he was there in real life. The sight was far worse than anything that had appeared on the tiny monitor screen. The conditions in which the child was being kept were beyond horrific. He was dirty, nearly naked, and his hands were bound. Food was scattered on the floor, but the floor itself was ice cold. In fact, it seemed like the boy had been sleeping on this freezing concrete surface. But that wasn't even the worst part. The boy was not alone. The first child, the one originally seen on the footage, was 8-year-old Andrei. But with him in the basement was another child, his 6-year-old brother, Jakub. Both boys were the biological children of one of the sisters. Clara and Katerina were immediately arrested. The police asked Clara why the children were locked in the basement. She simply responded with a cryptic statement, "No matter what I say, you won't understand." A chilling question remained: what on earth was happening in this house? As soon as the news broke, the quiet town of Kuřim was thrown into the spotlight. This story was met with horror and confusion. How could someone inflict such suffering on their own children, pushing them to the brink of survival? That was the question, and the answer was yet to be uncovered. And if you think the most brutal and shocking part has already been told, believe me, everything you've heard so far is just the beginning. Andrei, Jakub, and Anna were placed in an orphanage. Despite the fact that the two boys had endured horrific physical abuse, they remained relatively calm and friendly. Upon initial examination, scars were also found on Anna's body, though they were not as fresh as those on the boys. Judging by her unstable behavior, it was clear that she had suffered more psychologically than physically. But then, an unexpected twist occurred. 13-year-old Anna suddenly vanished from the orphanage. However, vanished might not be the right word. Given her fragile condition, it would have been nearly impossible for Anna to escape on her own. This could only mean one thing: someone had taken her. A large-scale search for the vulnerable young girl began immediately. At the same time, psychologists and police officers started working with Andrei, Jakub, Clara, and Katerina. Eventually, the authorities managed to piece together a truly horrifying reality. At first, things hadn't seemed so bad, quite the opposite, in fact. Clara had been a loving mother to her sons, Andrei and Jakub. They had never lacked anything, participated in sports, attended summer camps, and went to school. Clara cared for them deeply. However, she sometimes had conflicts with the boys' father. This was largely due to the fact that Clara and her sister, Katerina, were deeply religious. Katerina believed she had been given a divine mission, but Clara's husband did not share these views, leading to frequent arguments sometimes even physical altercations, which ultimately resulted in their divorce. Still, Clara's unusual beliefs had never affected her sons. As already mentioned, she had always treated them with love and care. However, as you may have guessed, something changed. In mid-2005, Clara visited her sister Katerina, who was not yet living with her at the time. To her surprise, she found a 13-year-old girl named Anna in Katerina's home. Katerina explained that she had met Anna at the children's center where she worked. Anna had endured a tragic life. She was an orphan from Norway. Both of her parents had been alcoholics, and as a child she had suffered terrible abuse at their hands. After her parents died, she was trafficked into sexual slavery, sold from one owner to another across various European countries, until she eventually ended up in the Czech Republic. Somehow, she managed to escape and found refuge at the children's center where Katerina worked. Moved by Anna's heartbreaking story, Katerina often took her home, and Clara soon developed a deep sympathy for the girl as well. They spent more and more time together, and Katerina noticed that Anna always seemed happier after being with Clara. Eventually, Clara suggested that Anna move in with her. Over time, Clara began treating Anna as her own daughter. Later, Katerina also moved in, and they all started living together under one roof: Clara, Katerina, Anna, Andrei, and Jakub. However, Anna's hardships did not end with her troubled childhood. She suffered from several serious illnesses, including leukemia, kidney failure, and problems with her vision and hearing. Fortunately, Katerina managed to find a doctor willing to take on Anna's treatment. About once a week, Katerina and Anna traveled to see him. However, Clara only met this doctor once, late at night in a hospital parking lot. It was so dark that she couldn't even see his face. Nonetheless, he showed her his diploma and Anna's medical records, which dispelled any doubts she had about his legitimacy. After that, all of their communication took place via text messages. The doctor prescribed various treatments for Anna, some of which were quite unusual. Anna needed to be kept comfortable and allowed plenty of rest, and Clara was instructed to give her full-body massages. The doctor emphasized that it was especially important to massage Anna's intimate areas, claiming that this would make her happier. Without hesitation, Clara followed all of his instructions. However, the doctor later informed her that the treatments were not working. Anna's hearing, kidney function, and heart condition were worsening. This made Clara even more focused on Anna, while her attention toward her own sons, Andrei and Jakub, steadily declined. They spent more and more time with their grandparents, while Clara devoted herself entirely to Anna. Then, the doctor told Clara something shocking. He claimed that her sons were jealous of Anna, and that they had no future except prison. He advised Clara to take extreme measures to cure the boys of their so-called evil spirits. This required strict discipline and severe punishment, supposedly for Anna's well-being. Clara obeyed without question. She began beating the boys for even the smallest infractions, often looking for any excuse to punish them. In addition to physical abuse, she sometimes deprived them of food, even when they behaved properly. Despite Clara's efforts, the doctor was not satisfied. In August 2006, he wrote to her, saying that the punishments were not harsh enough. He insisted that the boys needed shock therapy. This marked the most horrifying turn in the story. The doctor ordered Clara to stop treating them as her children entirely. He instructed her to take them to a remote cabin in the woods. Once again, Clara complied. She took her sons to an isolated cabin near the village of Viežička. There, they were met by Anna, Katerina, and 3 other people who had not yet been mentioned: Hanna Bashova and 2 men, Jan Škrla and Jan Turek. These 3 were acquaintances of Katerina, and they all worked at the same children's center as she did. The shock therapy began immediately upon the boys' arrival. They were placed in a cramped dog cage, where they spent most of their time. They could only kneel, ate from dog bowls, and had to relieve themselves inside the cage. They were strictly forbidden from speaking, to each other or to anyone else in the cabin. The only times they were let out of the cage were for torture sessions. They were forced to fight each other burned with cigarette butts, beaten with sticks and belts, cut with knives, and even gagged with tape. Their hands and feet were tied, but the torture wasn't just physical. At night, they were placed in freshly dug graves, deprived of sleep, and subjected to constant humiliation. This continued for 8 days. But the most horrifying event took place on the final day. That night, the abusers crossed a line so extreme it is almost impossible to comprehend. Andrzej was pulled out of the cage and thrown onto the floor. His own mother, Klara, took a knife and sliced a piece of flesh from his buttocks. The raw flesh was then passed around, and each person took a bite. After 8 days of unimaginable torment, Klara, Katerina, Anna, Andrzej, and Jakub returned home. But, as we already know, the torture did not end there. Klara began locking the boys in the basement more frequently. Around this time, she also decided to finalize Anna's adoption. However, since Anna had almost no documents, which significantly complicated matters, using her connections, Katerina managed to bypass these legal obstacles. A series of forged documents were created, and instead of Anna, another girl appeared in court, the daughter of a local actor who was paid for this. It worked, and the court eventually approved the procedure. Klara officially became Anna's mother. The abuse of the children continued for almost 8 months until, on May 7, 2007, Edward accidentally caught a signal from a camera in Klara and Katerina's house. As we already know, the women were eventually arrested, and the boys and Anna were sent to an orphanage. Just a couple of days later, Anna disappeared from the orphanage. A little over 6 months after these events, in another country, Norway, in the city of Oslo, a child also went missing from an orphanage. This was a 13-year-old boy named Adam. He hadn't spent much time in the orphanage, only a month. Initially, he had come to the orphanage himself, claiming that his father abused him and even subjected him to sexual violence. After his disappearance, extensive searches began. Adam was eventually found a month later in another Norwegian city, Tromsø. However, the police made an unexpected discovery. This was not a boy, but a girl. It was the same girl who had gone missing from the orphanage in the Czech Republic, Anna. Somehow she had ended up in Norway, where she posed as a boy who had been abused by his parents. In January 2008, she was returned to the Czech Republic. By this time, the Czech police knew a bit more about the 13-year-old Anna. Anna was not her real name. Her actual name was Barbara Shklova. Oh, and one more important detail. She was not 13 years old, but 33. As surprising as it may sound, the girl believed to be 13 was actually older than Klara, the woman who had adopted her. At this point, it would be more accurate to stop calling her Anna and refer to her by her real name, Barbara. After the case received massive media attention, photos and video footage of all the participants were shown everywhere. Given that Barbara, who was still perceived as Anna at the time, disappeared right after the children were freed, her photo appeared in the press more often than others. It was then that the police started receiving unexpected calls. Barbara was recognized by employees of the childcare center where Katerina worked. It turned out that Barbara had also worked there, but only until 2003. After that, she quit, and Katerina began telling everyone that Barbara had died. Of course, she hadn't died, but had instead started preparing a new identity for herself, that of a teenage girl. She managed this largely due to a rare condition that slowed her physical development. With proper preparation, Barbara could successfully pass as a teenager. But why? What was the purpose of all this? This is perhaps the most complex part of the story. Barbara was also arrested, but unlike the others, she was not charged with child abuse. Instead, she was charged with failing to report a crime. This meant that she knew about the abuse that others were inflicting on Andrzej and Yakov, but did not inform the authorities. Barbara claimed that she was just as much a victim as Andrzej and Yakov, and there was evidence to support this. Barbara's body, like the boys, bore many scars and cigarette burns. Klara, the woman who had adopted Barbara, couldn't believe until the very end that Barbara was not 13 but 33 years old. It took the police a lot of time, photos, and documents to make Klara realize the truth. When Clara finally understood, she remembered that she had actually met Barbara before she began posing as 13-year-old Anna. Back then, Barbara was much heavier, spoke differently, and behaved differently. She didn't look like a child. Clara couldn't imagine that the Barbara she had once known and Anna were the same person. Realizing how deeply and cruelly she had been deceived, Clara, who had previously kept information about Barbara to herself, now claimed that Barbara was not a victim, but had actively participated in the abuse of the boys. This, of course, raises the question, where did the scars and burns on Barbara's body come from? The burns from cigarette butts were explained fairly quickly. Upon re-examination, the number of burns on Barbara's body had increased, indicating that she had inflicted them on herself. As for the scars, they were not from torture or abuse, but from plastic surgeries. To make herself look more like a child, Barbara had undergone breast reduction and liposuction. Oh, and Barbara also claimed that she had been raped, but an examination showed that she was still a virgin. Now that the prosecutor had grounds to charge Barbara with child abuse, her story changed slightly. She admitted to participating in the abuse, but claimed that she was forced to do so. According to Barbara, Katerina and Hanna Basova had threatened her, saying that if she refused, she would be locked in a cage with the boys. Barbara admitted that she had known Katerina and Hanna for a long time and that these two women had convinced her, even drugging her, to pose as a 13-year-old. And the cherry on top of this horrifying story. Remember that Clara received instructions via SMS from a certain doctor? This doctor supposedly pressured Clara to abuse her sons. Well, it turned out that there was no doctor. The messages were written by Clara's sister, Katerina, and Barbara Sklova. On June 17, 2008, the trial of all the participants in this case began. Clara Maurer, Katerina Maurer, Hanna Basova, Jan Turek, Jan Sklo, and Barbara Sklova. The last two, by the way, turned out to be brother and sister. Out of the 6, only one person admitted guilt. Can you guess who? It's not hard to figure out. It was the boy's mother, Clara. Each defendant underwent psychological tests, and all 6 were found to have some form of mental issues. In Clara's case, it was concluded that her emotions were exaggerated. She was easily influenced, couldn't live without the support of others, was highly dependent on others' opinions, and needed approval in almost every matter. In other words, she was very easy to manipulate. The others showed clear sadistic tendencies, a desire to dominate or manipulate others' opinions. This was especially true for Katerina, who also exhibited pedophilic tendencies. Everything fell into place. One sister, Clara, was easily influenced, while the other, Katerina, sought to manipulate others. Thus, the main culprit behind everything that happened seemed to be Katerina. She remained silent for a long time, not offering any version of events, but toward the end she finally started to talk. According to her, she had indeed known Barbara for quite some time. They first studied together and later worked together. Throughout this period, Katerina felt sorry for Barbara, seeing her as clumsy and unfit for adult life. She believed that Barbara needed someone to take care of her, and she tried to provide that support. Then, at least according to Katerina, a mere coincidence occurred. Clara visited her home and saw Barbara, mistaking her for a child. Katerina decided to play along, thinking that Clara was exactly the kind of person who could take care of Barbara, who was completely incapable of living independently. Of course, Katerina manipulated Clara, but that did not justify her actions, and like everyone else involved, she had to face justice. On October 5, 2008, the court announced the sentences. Barbara Skrlova, 5 years, Jan Turek, 5 years, Jan Skrla, 7 years, Hanna Basova, 7 years, Clara Maurova, 9 years, Katerina Maurova, 10 years in prison. As you might expect, all of these sentences have already been served. Every individual involved in this case is now free, and in reality, most of them served less time than they were originally sentenced to. After her release, Clara reconnected with her family and was allowed to see her children, although she was not permitted to live with them. Custody of the boys was transferred to their grandparents. Katerina, on the other hand, cut all ties with her family, and her current whereabouts remain unknown. Barbara changed her name after being released. Her time in prison worsened her mental health to the extent that she was eventually declared disabled. So far, everything mentioned is the official version of events, the version in which a group of sadists tortured children simply because they were mentally unstable and predisposed to cruelty. However, there is also another unofficial theory. According to this version, the person truly responsible for everything that happened never faced any consequences at all. Earlier, I mentioned that the doctor in this story never actually existed and that the messages supposedly from him were written by Katerina and Barbara. But you might also remember that Clara once had a meeting with someone in a hospital parking lot, someone who introduced himself as a doctor. This meeting really did take place, but the man was not a doctor. His name was Josef Skurla, and he was Barbara Skurlova's father. Throughout the entire trial, Josef was called to testify only once, and even then, just as a witness. But after the case was closed, he mysteriously disappeared from the Czech Republic. And he had good reason to vanish, because soon after, disturbing details about him started to emerge. Once the case gained widespread attention, it was revealed that many years ago Josef Skurla had been a member of a religious cult known as the Grail movement. However, even among a group that practiced strict and sometimes cruel rules, Josef was considered too extreme. He frequently crossed the line, attempting to manipulate other cult members to gain power, and when manipulation failed, he resorted to threats. After being expelled from the Grail movement, Josef founded his own cult, called the Ants. He managed to recruit many former members of the Grail movement, primarily individuals who were mentally unstable and highly susceptible to influence. Over time, Josef built a strong network of connections, which allowed him to arrange the adoption of both Clara and Barbara, despite the fact that legally this should have been nearly impossible. Later, using these same connections, he orchestrated Barbara's escape from the orphanage, first to Denmark and then to Norway. As you might have already guessed, every person mentioned earlier, Klara Maurova, Katerina Maurova, Barbara Skurlova, Jan Turek, Jan Skurla, and Hanna Basova, were all members of Josef's cult, the Ants. So if Josef was the mastermind behind all the torture and abuse, what was his motive? Well, there are several unsettling details in this case. When police found the boys in the basement, they recorded everything on camera. The moment the boys saw the camera, their behavior changed. They became more lively, smiled, and even acted differently. This suggested that someone had trained them to interact with cameras, almost as if they had been coached to perform. Further investigation revealed high-end video equipment in Clara and Katerina's apartment. Equipment so expensive that it wasn't even sold in the Czech Republic. It had been imported from abroad. Authorities also discovered multiple discs containing footage of the boys in the basement. Beyond that, 2 additional apartments and 2 houses had been rented under Katerina's name, expenses that the sisters clearly could not afford on their own. All of this pointed to an unsettling conclusion. The abuse was being filmed and systematically distributed, most likely sold to various depraved individuals. And the most logical explanation is that Josef Skurla was the one orchestrating everything. A man who ultimately disappeared and faced no punishment at all.